Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where the lights are low, the world outside has gone quiet, and the only thing left to do is close your eyes and listen. Before we begin tonight, I want to say a quick thank you to Patrick, who suggested tonight's topic. You asked for the Phoenix Lights, and you asked for the version of the story that lives underneath the version everybody thinks they know. So that is exactly what we are going to do tonight. Thank you for sending it in. And thank you for being part of this strange little community of ours. So get comfortable, turn the lights down or off. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let your jaw unclench. Take one slow breath in and let it out even slower and let tonight go. We are going to Arizona. We are going to the 13th of March in the year 1997. And we are going to talk about the night that thousands of people looked up at the same time. This is the Phoenix Lights, the night they hid the sky. Before the story begins, imagine the desert. Not the desert of postcards, all orange rock and dramatic sunset. The other one, the one that exists after dark when the heat has finished bleeding out of the ground and the air turns thin and cold and clean. The kind of clean you can taste. The kind of air that carries sound too well so that a truck on a highway 4 miles away sounds like it is idling in your driveway. In March, Arizona nights are cool. The days can climb toward 80 degrees, but the moment the sun drops behind the mountains, the temperature falls like something dropped down a well. People go inside. They turn on their televisions. They start dinner. They put children in bathtubs and complain about work and let the day fold itself up and put itself away. Above them, the sky is enormous. That is the thing about desert skies that photographs never manage to capture. Not the stars, though. There are more of them out there than most people ever see in a lifetime. It is the emptiness between the stars, the scale of it, the way the darkness up there feels less like a ceiling and more like an ocean turned upside down over your head, and you're standing at the bottom of it, small and warm and entirely unaware of how thin the roof of your house really is. On the night of the 13th of March, 1997, that ocean moved, and thousands of people all across one state stopped what they were doing at almost exactly the same moment and walked outside and looked up. Let us begin with a man in the air. He's flying a routine approach into Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. It is an approach he has flown so many times that his hands make most of the small corrections before his brain has finished asking for them. The instrument panel glows a soft, familiar green. The cabin behind him is full of tired passengers who have already put their books away. Below him, the valley is spreading out in that grid of orange sodium light that every American city wears at night. Phoenix from the air looks like circuitry, perfect right angles, arteries of moving headlights, dark rectangles where the golf courses and the parks refuse to glow. Everything is normal. Everything is exactly the way it always is. And then the co-pilot goes quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a man concentrating. A different quiet. The kind of silence that arrives in a cockpit when somebody sees something they do not have a category for, and their brain is buying time while it searches for one. The pilot looks up. Ahead of them, and slightly above, there is a formation of lights. His first instinct is the correct professional one. Aircraft. Traffic. Something scheduled and explainable and boring. His eyes go to the shape and start counting, because counting is what pilots do. 5 lights, maybe 6, maybe 7, depending on how you interpret the ones at the outer edges. They are arranged in a wide, shallow V. They are not blinking. That is the first thing that is wrong. Every aircraft in the sky over the United States wears a specific arrangement of blinking lights, and pilots read those arrangements the way you read the letters on a road sign. Red on the left, green on the right, white at the tail, a strobe that pulses so that you can find the thing in the dark and judge its distance and heading. These lights do none of that. They are steady, amber or gold or a warm white that does not sit comfortably on any of those words. They simply burn. The second thing that is wrong takes him a moment longer. They are not moving relative to one another. If those were separate aircraft flying in formation, there would be drift. there is always drift. Even the finest military display teams in the world breathe a little as they fly, tiny corrections rippling through the formation as each pilot fights the air. These lights hold their positions as though they have been painted onto a single sheet of glass. The third thing that is wrong is the worst: the stars. The pilot follows the shape of the V with his eyes and realizes that between the lights, where there should be sky, there is nothing. No stars. The constellations he has known his entire adult life simply stop at one edge of the shape and pick up again on the other side, as though something enormous and completely dark has been laid across them. The co-pilot finds his voice. He asks in a low tone whether the pilot is seeing the size of that thing. The pilot does not answer, because he is doing arithmetic. He knows his altitude. He can estimate his distance from the object by the way the city lights below it are being interrupted, and from those two numbers he can work out how wide the thing has to be, and the number that comes back is so absurd that he throws it away and does the arithmetic again. He gets the same answer. He does not say the number out loud. Not that night, not for years. He reaches for the radio instead. Air traffic control acknowledges. Their voice is calm, professional, unhurried, and for one brief exchange there is a completely ordinary conversation about unusual lights in the airspace north of the field. Another aircraft chimes in. Someone else has eyes on it too. There is a moment, no longer than a minute, in which the whole thing is being handled the way anything unusual gets handled in aviation, which is to say methodically and without drama. And then the radio changes, not dramatically. Nothing so obvious as a click or static or a voice being cut off mid-word. It is subtler and, to a pilot, far more strange. The subject simply ends. The controller moves to the next transmission, then the next. Vectors, altitudes, runway assignments. The ordinary rhythm of the night reasserts itself, and the enormous silent shape hanging over the northern edge of the valley is not mentioned again by anyone on any frequency for the remainder of the approach. The pilot will think about that for the rest of his life, not the lights, the silence afterward. As he turns onto final, he sees something else. Off to the west, far out toward the ranges where the military owns most of the ground and all of the air above it, aircraft are climbing. He can pick them out by their strobes, hard white pulses stitching upward through the dark, several of them, moving fast. He feels for a moment something close to relief. That is the system working. That is exactly what he would expect. An unidentified object of that size, over a metropolitan area, and somebody's going up to have a look at it. Intercept, identify, escort it out of the airspace if necessary. Good. He lands. He shuts down. He walks through the terminal with his flight bag over his shoulder, past passengers on payphones and cleaning crews and a bar with a television turned to a basketball game. He goes to his hotel. He sleeps. And for years, that is where the story sits in his memory. A strange formation, an odd radio silence, and a scramble of military aircraft doing their job. It is only much later, when he is retired, when he has read enough accounts and cross-referenced enough timelines and spoken to enough people who were also awake that night, that he goes back to that final image and looks at it properly. The aircraft were climbing to the west. The object was to the north and heading south. They were never on an intercept course. They were not going to meet it head-on. They were not going to box it in. They were rising into a position ahead of it and slightly below, on a heading that would let them fall into place around it as it passed, the way a motorcade forms up around a vehicle it is protecting. The pilot spends a long time trying to find another word for the manoeuvre he watched that night. The only word that keeps fitting is escort. That is where we will leave him for now, standing in an empty hangar decades later, with a coffee going cold in his hand, having just realised that the most extraordinary thing he ever saw was not the object. It was the way everyone else in the sky behaved around it. Now let us go down to the ground. The first calls come from the north. It is somewhere around 7:30 in the evening, In the small communities scattered along the high desert corridor between the Nevada line and the mountains above Phoenix, dinner is being cleared away. Kids are avoiding homework. Somebody's walking a dog along a road with no streetlights, because out there, streetlights are a thing that happens to other people, and a man in a place called Paulden looks up. Paulden is not a city. It is barely a town. It is a scatter of homes and ranch properties on high open ground, where the wind comes down off the plateau, and the night sky above it is one of the darkest in the continental United States. When you look up in Paulden, you see the Milky Way as a genuine river, a bright smear of dust and light that our ancestors named and worshipped and navigated by, and that most modern people have never once seen with their own eyes. The man is not a UFO enthusiast. He has never called anyone about anything in the sky in his life. He is simply outside doing something ordinary, and he glances up. There are lights coming down from the northwest, 4 of them, maybe 5, moving together in a formation that is impossible to mistake for stars because stars do not travel, and impossible to mistake for aircraft because aircraft make noise. He waits for the sound. That is the detail he will repeat to everyone who ever asks him about it. He stood there in the freezing high desert air, with his head tilted back, and he waited for the sound, and it never came. Not a rumble, not a hum, not the distant tearing whisper of a jet at altitude. The light slid across the entire visible sky, from one horizon toward the other, in complete and total silence. He goes inside and calls the National UFO Reporting Center. It is the first documented report of the night. It will not be the last, because the thing, whatever it is, keeps going south. And south of Paulden is Chino Valley, and south of Chino Valley is Prescott, and Prescott Valley and Dewey. And south of those is the long descent through the mountains, and then the enormous glowing bowl of the Phoenix metropolitan area. Home at that time to well over 2 million people. The object is heading directly toward all of them. In Prescott, a man is outside with his son when they notice a cluster of lights approaching from the north. He's a person who pays attention to aircraft. He knows what a plane looks like at night, and he knows what a plane sounds like at night, and this satisfies neither definition. He watches the formation pass almost directly overhead, and what he describes afterward is not the lights at all. It is the shape between them. He says the stars went out. He says he could trace an outline by the absence of stars, a vast, dark, wedge-shaped nothing gliding above him, and the only way to perceive it was to watch the sky itself being erased section by section as it passed. That description, or some version of it, is going to be repeated by witness after witness after witness across the entire length of the state. It becomes the signature of the event, not the brightness, the blackness, not what people saw, what they stopped being able to see. In Dewey, a family stands in their driveway. In Chino Valley, a woman calls her neighbour and tells her to come outside right now. In Cordis Lakes and Black Canyon City and Anthem, people who have no connection to one another and no way of coordinating their stories are all doing the same thing at the same time, which is standing very still in the cold with their heads tipped back, feeling something they mostly cannot describe. Several of them use the same word later. The word is wrong. Not frightening, not exciting. Wrong. As though a fundamental rule about how the world is supposed to work had been quietly suspended above their houses, and they could feel it in the base of the skull the way animals feel a storm coming. Speaking of animals. Across the northern corridor, dogs go strange. This is one of the more consistently reported and least discussed details of the entire event. Dogs that never bark start barking. Dogs that always bark go silent and refuse to move. Horses in corrals bunch against fence lines. Cattle drift toward the far corners of their enclosures and stand there, facing the same direction, which is not toward the lights, but away from them. By 8 o'clock the emergency lines are lighting up. Try to picture the inside of a dispatch centre on a normal Thursday night in March. It is a room built for a specific and predictable kind of chaos. Car accidents, domestic disturbances, chest pains, a bar fight. The people who work there have heard everything, and the reason they are good at their jobs is that almost nothing genuinely surprises them anymore. Now picture that room when every line starts ringing at once. The callers do not sound like the callers dispatchers are used to. They are not screaming. There is no emergency in the ordinary sense. Nobody is bleeding. Nobody is in danger. What the dispatchers hear instead, over and over, is a particular quality of voice that is much harder to handle than panic. It is the sound of a reasonable adult trying very hard to sound reasonable. They apologise before they describe anything. They say they know how this sounds. They say they are not the kind of person who calls about this sort of thing. A nurse, a machinist, a retired police officer, a man who flew helicopters in the service, and who therefore has spent more hours looking at the night sky than the dispatcher has spent awake this month. And then they describe the same thing. Lights in a V, silence, enormous, slow. Some of them ask questions the dispatchers cannot answer. Somebody wants to know if there is an air show. Somebody wants to know if the base is running an exercise. Somebody wants to know if they should get their children away from the windows. And a number of callers in different towns at different moments ask a version of the same question, and it is the question that will eventually become the whole story. They ask why nobody is stopping it. Because that is the thing. If a slow-moving object the size of several city blocks drifted over the middle of America with no transponder, no radio contact, and no engine noise, at an altitude low enough that people on the ground could see it blot out constellations, something should happen. Sirens, jets, announcements. A voice on the radio telling everyone what is going on. Instead, there is nothing. The object crosses the entire state on a leisurely southbound course, over a major metropolitan area, over an international airport, over a region ringed by some of the most heavily used military airspace in the United States, and the response, from the outside, appears to be nothing at all. By around 8:30, it is over the valley itself. Now the witness count goes from hundreds to thousands. This is the part of the story that separates the Phoenix Lights from almost every other case in the history of the subject. Most reports of unidentified objects are lonely things. One person on a back road, a couple on a beach, a pilot with a story and no corroboration. They can be dismissed easily because there is nothing to hold them up. That night, an entire metropolitan area was a witness. People saw it from freeway overpasses and stopped their cars on the shoulder. People saw it from restaurant parking lots. People stood on the flat roofs of apartment buildings. A father woke his children and carried them outside in pyjamas because he understood, in some instinctive way, that this was going to matter later. Neighbours who had never spoken stood together on lawns. A woman in Phoenix later described a moment that is, to me, the emotional centre of the whole event. She said the strange part was not the object. The strange part was the sound of a city noticing something at the same time. She said she could hear, from her own front yard, doors opening up and down the street. She could hear the specific rhythm of screen doors banging and voices calling out, and footsteps on driveways spreading outward like a ripple, as one house after another realised that something was happening and came outside to look. Thousands of people in the dark on their own lawns, all silent, all facing the same direction, and above them, sliding south, that immense soundless wedge. Some of them filmed it. That is the other thing that makes this case unusual. This is 1997, a few years before everyone had a camera in their pocket, but camcorders were common enough that a number of people got footage. The video is famously unsatisfying, which is the curse of every event like this. Bright points on a black field. No sense of scale, no sense of the thing between the lights. But there is one detail the footage does capture, and it is the detail that unsettles researchers to this day. The lights do not wobble. Handheld footage from that era wobbles constantly. Any object being filmed by a person standing in their yard drifts around in frame. But when you track the lights relative to each other across the footage, they hold. The geometry does not change. Not a degree, not a fraction. Whatever those lights were attached to, they were attached to the same thing, and that thing was very, very large. Now, the governor, the man in charge of the state of Arizona in March of 1997, was named Fife Symington. He was a Republican, a former Air Force officer, and importantly for this story, a pilot. He knew aircraft. He had spent time in the sky and around people who spent their lives in the sky. On the night of the 13th, he received information about what was happening. Calls were coming into state offices as well as local ones. Something was moving over Arizona and thousands of people wanted to know what it was. Months later, in June, with the story refusing to die and news outlets still pushing for answers, the governor held a press conference. He announced that he had found the culprit. The doors opened and in came a figure in a silver alien costume, complete with an oversized head, escorted by a deputy. The room laughed. Cameras flashed. The joke played on the evening news across the country. The message could not have been clearer, and it did exactly what it was designed to do, which is make an entire subject unsafe to discuss in public. If you were a serious professional in Arizona in the summer of 1997, that press conference told you something very specific. It told you that if you said what you saw out loud, you were going to be filed away with the man in the rubber suit. People stopped talking. Not all of them, but many. And that is where the story would have ended, except for what happened roughly a decade later. Fife Symington gave an interview and said that he had seen it too. He described being out that night, looking up and watching an enormous object move through the sky above the valley. He described it as something that did not match any aircraft he knew of, and he was a man who knew aircraft. He said it was massive, and that it was unlike anything he had encountered in his life. He was then asked the obvious question: why the costume? Why the joke? His answer was, in its way, more chilling than any conspiracy theory. He said he was worried about panic. He said that as governor, with thousands of frightened people calling in and no explanation available, his job was to keep the state calm. So he did the one thing guaranteed to diffuse the situation instantly. He made it funny. He turned an unexplained event into a punchline, and in doing so, he shut the whole thing down. Now, sit with that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. A sitting governor of an American state watched something in the sky he could not explain, judged that the public could not handle the truth of his own uncertainty, and deliberately used ridicule as a tool of crowd control. He did not lie about facts. He did something more elegant than that. He made the facts embarrassing to mention. That is the point in this story, where the official record and the conspiracy start walking beside each other for a while, close enough to touch. Because here is what the official record eventually settled on. The United States Air Force stated that the lights seen hovering over the Phoenix area later that evening in the 10 o'clock hour were illumination flares. Specifically, flares dropped by aircraft from the Maryland Air National Guard during a training exercise over the Barry Goldwater Range, southwest of the city. High-intensity flares suspended under parachutes, drifting slowly downward, hanging in a line in the sky, and then extinguishing one by one as they burned out or dropped behind the Estrella mountain range. And I want to be fair here, because this is important. That explanation genuinely does account for a large portion of what people photographed that night. The famous still images of a row of lights hanging over the city, the ones that appear in every documentary, are consistent with flares. The way the lights blinked out in sequence is consistent with an object dropping behind a mountain ridge. That part of the case is for most researchers considered reasonably well explained. The problem is the timing. The flares were in the 10 o'clock hour. The formation, the enormous silent V that crossed the entire state, was seen 2.5 hours earlier, moving from north to south, hundreds of miles from the range, over an area where no flares were dropped. Two separate events, one explained, one not. And the official record, in the eyes of many witnesses, quietly used the explanation for the second one to make the first one go away. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is just how information behaves when it is handled carelessly, or carefully, depending on your assumptions. But now let us step over the line. From here on, Everything you hear is fiction, a story, a speculation dressed up in the clothes of a real night. Nothing beyond this point should be mistaken for history. Let us go to Luke Air Force Base. Luke sits west of Phoenix, out where the suburbs finally give up and the ground goes flat and pale and empty. In 1997 it is a fighter training base, one of the busiest in the world, and on any given night there are technicians in dim rooms watching screens where every aircraft in a vast volume of airspace appears as a small moving symbol. In our story, one of those technicians is a young sergeant. It is a Thursday. His shift is unremarkable. He's watching commercial traffic stack up into Sky Harbour and a handful of military tracks working in the ranges to the south. Then the northern edge of his display develops a problem. There is a return there that should not exist. It is enormous. Not enormous like a heavy transport aircraft, enormous like a weather event, and it is coming south at a speed so slow that at first he assumes it is ground clutter or an artifact, some ghost thrown up by the system. He reports it. His supervisor comes over. They look at it together and do the thing that professionals do when the instruments say something impossible, which is start checking the instruments. While they are doing that, the phone rings. Then it rings again, then a third line. The base is getting calls from civilians, from local police, from other facilities. Everyone is asking the same question, and the sergeant, watching that vast slow return crawl down the middle of his screen, realises that the instruments are not malfunctioning at all. But that is not the part he will remember. The part he will remember is the second track. At some point after the formation crosses into the southern half of the state, a separate return appears on his display, southwest of the metropolitan area, out over the empty ground where the ranges begin. It does not fly in from anywhere. It does not approach from the horizon. It simply is there, one sweep after not being there, and it is descending. He watches the altitude readout tick downward, not falling, not tumbling, a controlled, deliberate, absolutely steady descent, the numbers rolling down at a rate so consistent that it looks less like an aircraft and more like an elevator. He calls it out. His supervisor does not respond the way he expects. There is no confusion, no scramble to verify. Instead, the supervisor looks at the screen for perhaps 2 seconds, picks up a phone, dials a number he does not have to look up, and says a short sequence of words the sergeant does not understand. Within 4 minutes there are people in the room who do not work in that room. The sergeant is moved. Not removed, not questioned, simply and politely relocated to a different position, where a different screen shows a different volume of airspace. He's told the second track is a scheduled activity and is being handled at another level. When he comes back on shift 2 days later, the recorded data for that period is gone, not corrupted, not classified with a note in its place. Gone, as though the night had a hole cut out of it. He asks one question about it, gets one look in response and never asks again. And for 20 years he tells nobody, because he has a career and a family, and because the entire country has been taught, by a man in a silver costume on a stage in June, that this subject is a joke. But he never forgets what the readout looked like, because in his entire career he never once saw an aircraft descend that smoothly. Aircraft fight the air. Every foot of altitude an aircraft gives up is a negotiation with physics. The numbers stutter, they pause, they correct. That night the numbers came down like water finding a drain. Whatever it was not flying, it was arriving. Let me tell you about the ground beneath that descent. Southwest of Phoenix, past the last strip malls and the last irrigated fields, the map of Arizona changes character. The roads thin out. The names on the map stop referring to towns and start referring to features, mountains, washes, tanks, wells that were dug a century ago by people who did not survive the experience. And then, across an enormous span of that emptiness, the map turns into a single restricted block. The Barry Goldwater Range is a military training area larger than several American states. It stretches from the edge of the Phoenix metro region all the way down toward the border. a span of desert and mountain and dry lake bed that has been closed to the public since before most people listening tonight were born. Aircraft train there, ordnances dropped there. There are places inside it where nobody has walked in living memory, and other places where the ground is so littered with the leavings of half a century of exercises that walking is genuinely lethal. It is one of the most perfectly isolated pieces of ground in the developed world. It is ringed by mountains that block line of sight. It is patrolled. It is legally sealed. There is no highway crossing it, no town inside it, no reason for a civilian ever to be there, and the entire nation has been trained for decades to accept, without curiosity, that things happen in there which are none of their business. If you needed a place to bring something down where no one would see it, and you had the entire continental United States to choose from, you would choose this. In our story, that is exactly what somebody did. The planning documents, as they are described later, refer to something called a corridor, not a road, a route, a pre-approved sequence of movements, ground and air, running from a specific access point on the eastern boundary of the range to a set of coordinates roughly 40 miles inside it, with timings, checkpoints, and a list of units authorized to move along it. It has a name that sounds like paperwork, because that is how these things always sound. The most extraordinary operations in history are hidden inside the most boring language available. Nobody investigates a logistics annex. The corridor was written years before that night. It had been maintained, updated and reissued annually, like a fire drill nobody expected to run. On the evening of the 13th of March, 1997, it was activated for the first time, and that brings us to the flares. The official account of the later lights over Phoenix is, as I said, reasonably solid. High-intensity illumination flares, dropped in a line, hanging under parachutes, drifting and burning and dropping out of sight behind the mountains. But consider the geometry for a moment. Those flares were dropped in the airspace above the northern section of the range. From the perspective of a person standing in Phoenix, they hung in the western sky, right along the horizon, right above the mountains, right in the exact direction of the second track's descent. Now imagine you are a person in a suburban backyard that night. You have just watched something enormous cross the sky. You're shaken. You have called your family. You have called the news. And now, out west, a line of impossibly bright lights appears above the mountains and hangs there for minutes on end. Where are your eyes? They are up. They are locked on the horizon. They are pointed at the brightest thing in the sky. Every camera in the valley that night, every camcorder and every news crew and every police officer stepping out of a cruiser to look, all of them aimed at that line of light. And a line of light, hanging in the sky, is very good at hiding the ground beneath it. Look at a bright object at night for even a few seconds, and your eyes give up on everything darker. That is not a theory. That is just how the human eye works. A flare is not only a source of illumination, it is a source of blindness. According to the conspiracy, that is what they were for, not illumination, attention. While an entire metropolitan area stood in its yards and stared west at a row of burning lights, the thing that mattered was happening beneath those lights and behind those mountains, on the floor of a sealed desert range, in the dark. And there was exactly one person on the wrong side of the fence. His name, in our story, is Samuel Harlan. He is 61 years old. He runs cattle on a lease that shares its western boundary with restricted federal land, and he has done so for 34 years. He is a widower. He lives alone in a low house with a metal roof and a porch that faces the wrong way for sunsets, which he has always regretted. He is not the kind of man who believes in anything unusual. He's the kind of man whose entire life is a negotiation with weather, water, and the price of beef. His imagination, such as it is entirely occupied by fences. On the evening of the 13th, he is doing what he does most evenings. He has eaten. The television is on in the other room, tuned to nothing in particular, providing that low murmur that people who live alone use to keep the house from being too quiet. At around 8:45, the cattle start moving. He hears it before he understands it. There is a specific sound to a herd going wrong, a rolling drum of hooves and a rising pitch of noise, and any rancher knows it in his spine before his brain catches up. He's on his feet and out the door with his boots half on. The herd is running, not drifting, not milling, running, hard, in one direction, and the direction is east, away from the range, away from the mountains. They are pressing against the eastern fence line with enough weight that he can hear the post complaining 1/4 mile away. He shouts at them, which does nothing. Then he notices the dogs. He has 3. They are working dogs, and their entire purpose in life is to be exactly where cattle are being loud. They should be out there already. Instead, they are on the porch, all 3, pressed flat against the boards with their bellies down and their ears back, and when he calls them, not one of them moves. One of them is shaking. He goes back inside for a flashlight and hears that every radio in the house has gone to static. The television in the other room is doing the same thing, a wall of grey noise where a picture used to be. The little transistor radio he keeps on the kitchen windowsill, the one he uses for market reports, is hissing. He stands in his own kitchen and feels the hair rise on his forearms, and then the valley turns blue. Not from above. That is the detail he cannot ever get people to understand afterward. It did not come down from the sky like lightning. It came from beyond the western ridge, throwing light upward and outward, so that for perhaps 4 seconds the underside of the entire cloud layer, the ridgeline, his barn, his hands, everything was lit in a cold, pale blue that had no flicker in it at all. Flame flickers. Lightning stutters. This was constant, like a switch had been thrown. Then it faded. Not abruptly. It dimmed, evenly and smoothly over several seconds, and the darkness that came back afterward was darker than before, the way it always is after your eyes have been given something bright to look at. Sam Harlan does what any rancher in America would do at that moment. He assumes it is a fire, because that is the only thing out there that makes light, and a fire on that ground, in that wind, with his herd on the wrong side of it, is the single worst thing he can imagine. He grabs the flashlight and the truck keys and drives up the track to the top of his own ridge, and he gets out and he looks west. There is no fire. There is an object in the air roughly 2 miles away above the flat, and it is coming down. He describes it later in the flattest possible language, which is what makes his account so hard to dismiss. He says it looked like a shape with lights on it. He says he could not tell what colour it was because it did not seem to have a colour, only edges. He says it was big, and when pressed on how big, he compares it to the grain elevator in the town where he was born, and then, after a long pause, says that maybe it was bigger than that. It descends without sound. No engines, no rotor wash, no roar of displaced air, not even the high whine of something electrical under load. 2 miles is close enough that any conventional aircraft of that size would be shaking the ground under his boots. He hears the wind. He hears his own truck ticking as it cools. That is all. The object settles into a dry wash below the ridge, and dust rises around it in a slow, pale ring, and then the ring drifts and thins, and the desert goes quiet. And when I say quiet, I mean something specific. Sam Harlan has spent his entire life outdoors at night, and he will tell you that the desert is never silent. There is always something. Insects, wind through creosote, a distant dog, the tick and settle of ground giving up its heat. For a period he estimates at somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes there was nothing. He stood on that ridge in a silence so total that he could hear the blood in his own ears, and he understood, in a way that had nothing to do with thinking, that he was not supposed to be there. Then he heard the helicopters. They came from the north, low and fast, and they were dark. He counted 4, then 6, then lost count as they crossed the ridge and dropped toward the wash. No navigation lights, no strobes, just a hammering wall of sound arriving where, moments before, there had been no sound at all. Behind them, on the ground, the trucks came. Sam Harlan stood on his own ridge, on his own land, in the dark, and watched a convoy move along a track he'd assumed nobody used anymore. Heavy flatbeds with low loaders, vehicles with plating on them, 2 buses with their windows blacked out, which is the detail that stayed with him the longest, because a bus means people, and a blacked out bus means people who are not supposed to see where they're going, or people who are not supposed to be seen. The convoy went through the boundary gate and into the range. He waited on that ridge for a long time. He does not know how long. Long enough that his hands got cold on the truck door and he did not notice. Nothing came back out. He drove home. He did not sleep. At dawn he went out again and looked west, and there was nothing to see, because there is never anything to see out there, and by then even he was starting to talk himself out of it. 2 days later, 2 men came to his door. They were polite. They were not in uniform. They said there had been an aircraft incident in the training area, and that debris may have been scattered, and they asked, in the pleasant tone of people who have asked this question many times, whether he had found anything unusual on his property. He said no. They gave him a phone number and told him to call if that changed. And then one of them, on the way back to the vehicle, said something that Sam Harlan turned over in his head for the rest of his life. He said it casually, the way you say something that does not matter. He said it was a shame about the noise, and that he hoped it had not frightened the animals. Sam had not mentioned the animals. He had not mentioned anything. The story of what happened inside the range that night comes to us, in this telling, through a woman named Dr. Claire Morgan. She's a former Air Force engineer. She spent 11 years in aerospace materials work, most of it dull, some of it classified, all of it conducted inside a system where the most important skill is knowing which questions have no upside. She leaves the service in the early 2000s and moves into private research, and she becomes interested in the way careful people become interested in things, in a very specific anomaly. Not lights, not sightings, paperwork. Her insight is a simple one, and it is the reason her fictional investigation feels so plausible. She reasons that no matter how secret an operation is, it still has to be paid for, staffed, supplied, and cleaned up. Aircraft have to be fueled, personnel have to be housed, equipment has to be signed out and signed back in, and every one of those transactions leaves a residue in the mundane administrative record, because you can classify the mission, but you cannot classify the diesel. So she does not look for the secret, she looks for its shadow. And in a set of routine logistics records covering the spring of 1997, she finds a designation that does not appear in any published program list, tucked between entries about hangar maintenance and vehicle servicing. Project Sunset. The description attached to it, when there is one, is Aerospace Recovery Logistics Support. That is a phrase engineered to make your eyes slide off it. It sounds like a team that goes and picks up crashed drones. But she starts building a timeline of every date Project Sunset appears in the record. There are 9 dates over a 14-year span, and every single one of them, without exception, falls within 72 hours of a documented cluster of unexplained aerial sightings somewhere in the American Southwest. Not near them, within them. The 13th of March, 1997, is one of the 9. What she pieces together about the recovery itself is fragmentary, which is exactly how she would expect it to be. There is no single document that says what was found. There is instead a scatter of ordinary records that describe, collectively, something extraordinary. There are requisitions for cutting equipment, which is normal for a crash recovery. Then there are follow-up requisitions for different cutting equipment, escalating in capability over the course of 2 days, ending with a request for industrial diamond abrasives and a plasma unit normally used in heavy shipbuilding. Whatever they were trying to get into, they could not get into it. There is a materials analysis request that includes a line item Morgan has never seen on a crash recovery form in her life. It asks for lattice imaging at atomic scale. That is not the sort of test you run on aircraft wreckage. You run that when you want to know how something was made, at the level of individual atoms, because nothing about how it was made makes sense. The summary of that analysis, if it ever existed, is not in the record. What survives is a single follow-up memorandum, and its entire content is a request for guidance on how to classify a material that does not correspond to any entry in the standard reference index. Morgan reads that sentence many times. It is not a claim about aliens. It is not a dramatic statement. It is a mid-level technical officer, working within a bureaucracy, politely asking his superiors what box to put something in, because none of the boxes fit. That, she says later, is what convinced her. Not the extraordinary claims, the ordinary confusion. But the metallurgy is not the strange part. The strange part is the biology. Roughly 19 hours after the first convoy entered the range, a second group was moved in. Morgan traces them through housing allocations and transport manifests, because people have to sleep somewhere and eat something, and those records are astonishingly persistent. The second group is small, fewer than a dozen. Their equipment list is not an engineering list. It includes refrigerated containment units. It includes portable laboratory modules of a type used for handling biological material under isolation. It includes full environmental suits with independent air supply, of a specification well beyond what you would wear for fuel vapour or composite dust. It includes surgical instruments. Morgan reads that list as an engineer and reaches an engineer's conclusion. No aircraft accident of any kind involving any technology in the world in 1997 requires you to fly in a sealed cold storage unit and a set of scalpels. You bring cold storage when there is something that will spoil. You bring scalpels when there is something you intend to open. And you bring isolation suits when you genuinely do not know what you're about to be exposed to. She never finds a document that says what the second team found. She finds only the shape of the space where that document should be. But she does find one more thing, and it is small, and it is the kind of detail that sits in your chest afterward. In a transport request for that second team, someone filled out a field labelled Special Handling Requirements. They wrote a single instruction: maintain temperature, do not open, now let us bring in the man who carried it. In this story, his name is Captain David Mercer, and he is a retired Air Force transport pilot. In the spring of 1997, he was 38 years old, flying cargo runs, holding a clearance, and doing the thing that transport crews do, which is move things from one place to another without asking what they are. 23 years later, he contacts a journalist named Rebecca Sloan. He does not do it dramatically. He does not use a burner phone or a parking garage. He sends a short email from an account created for the purpose, saying that he flew a cargo run out of Arizona in March of 1997, and that he has thought about it every week since, and that he is now sick, and that being sick has changed his arithmetic about what he owes to whom. Sloan has heard from a lot of people who claim to have flown a lot of things. What makes her answer him is a detail in the second paragraph. He does not tell her what was in the container. He tells her he does not know. The people who are lying always know. His account, when she finally sits across from him, is short. That is the other thing that persuades her. It takes 11 minutes to tell. He was pulled off his scheduled rotation on short notice and sent to a field in Arizona he had not flown into before. He waited on the ground for 6 hours. He was not briefed on cargo. He was told the flight was a priority movement to a facility in Nevada, and he was given a routing that kept him away from populated areas in a way he found unusual. The cargo was loaded at night, under lights, by personnel who were not part of the ground crew. It was one container. He describes it precisely, because pilots describe things precisely. It was roughly the size of a large chest freezer. It was sealed. It had an external power connection, and it was drawing power the entire flight, feeding a refrigeration unit that ran continuously, which is why he could hear it over the aircraft. 2 armed personnel flew with it. They did not sit. They stood, one at each end, for the entire flight. They did not speak to the crew. When Mercer asked one of them a routine question about strap tension, the man looked at him and said nothing at all. And the weight. Mercer remembers the weight because weight is the one number a transport pilot cannot ignore. Every flight is arithmetic. You cannot fly what you cannot lift, and you cannot balance what you do not measure. The manifest listed the cargo at exactly 312 pounds. He tells Sloane that he has spent 2 decades trying to make that number make sense. £312 is nothing. It is a motorcycle. It is a large man and his luggage. It is not an engine, not a wing section, not a fuselage panel, not a piece of any aircraft that would justify an armed escort, a dedicated flight, a specialised routing, and a refrigeration unit running for the entire duration. Whatever they were moving out of Arizona that week, it was small, cold, and worth more than the aircraft carrying it. Rebecca Sloane does what journalists do. She files requests. Under the Freedom of Information Act, she asks a series of agencies for radar records, communications logs, and flight activity data covering the evening of the 13th of March, 1997, over the state of Arizona. The responses take months. Some take years. And what comes back is not a wall of refusal. That is the part she finds most interesting. A flat refusal would be simple. A flat refusal is a door, and doors can be pushed on. Instead, she gets cooperation. She gets envelopes. She gets discs. She gets pages of tracking data, some of it genuinely useful, some of it redacted in the ordinary way, all of it delivered with the polite institutional shrug of an organisation that has nothing to hide and is happy to prove it. And then she starts assembling it into a timeline, and she notices the whole. Every source she has from every agency covers the evening thoroughly. Traffic into and out of Sky Harbor, military activity in the southern ranges, the routine, grinding, extraordinarily well-documented business of American airspace, except for one interval. There is a 23-minute window that is simply not represented anywhere. One agency reports that records for that period cannot be located. Another provides a file that begins after it. A third sends a dataset with a gap in the middle and an apologetic cover letter about archival transfer errors during a system migration in the early 2000s. Different agencies, different formats, different explanations, the same 23 minutes. Sloane is not a naive person. She knows records get lost. She knows migrations corrupt data, and boxes get misfiled, and things genuinely, boringly disappear all the time. If one agency had a gap, she would think nothing of it. 4 agencies losing the identical interval is not an accident. It is a policy that was implemented separately in 4 places, which means it came from somewhere above all 4, and when she overlays that window on the rest of the timeline, it sits exactly where the second track descends. Not near it, on it. Whatever happened in the sky southwest of Phoenix that night, it took 23 minutes, and someone decided the country did not need those 23 minutes back. The other thing Sloane does, and it takes her 4 years, is collect witnesses. She ends up with more than 200 first-hand statements gathered from people who were outdoors in Arizona that night. She organises them by location and by time. She cross-references them against each other. She's not looking for the dramatic accounts. She's looking for the boring ones, because the boring ones are the ones nobody has polished. And in that mass of testimony, she finds a pattern that almost nobody talks about. The people who are furthest from the object describe lights. The people who are beneath it describe an absence. Witness after witness who claim the object passed directly overhead uses some version of the same phrasing. They say they did not see a craft. They say they saw nothing at all. No hull, no panels, no seams or rivets or exhaust or texture, no surface of any kind. They say the stars went out. One woman, a schoolteacher in her 50s, describes lying on the hood of her car with her head back as the thing passed above her, and says that what frightened her was not that something was there. It was that nothing was there, and yet the sky was gone. She says it was like watching a hand pass in front of a window from the inside of a dark room. You do not see the hand, you see the window stop working. Sloane writes one line in her notes about this, and it is the line that keeps her awake. If it had no surface anyone could see, then everyone who says they saw the Phoenix lights is wrong about what they saw. They did not see a craft with lights on it. They saw lights, in a formation, around something that was not there, which raises a question that changes the shape of the entire story. What if the lights were not part of it? What if the lights were around it, the way a motorcade's lights are around a car? What if the reason the formation was so perfect, so unwavering, so geometrically flawless across every second of every piece of footage, is that it was not one object at all, but several, holding station around something enormous and dark that none of them wanted anyone to look at directly? That, according to the conspiracy, is what happened. The greatest mass sighting in modern American history was not a visitation. It was traffic control. Here is where Dr. Morgan's paperwork and Sloane's testimony finally meet. Morgan, still following the shadow of the money, finds that Project Sunset is not a program. It is a subordinate function. It is the field element, the people with the trucks and the cold storage, activated when needed. Above it sits something with a broader charter, and its designation is Operation Mirror. The name appears rarely, and never with a description. Morgan builds a picture of it the way you build a picture of a dark planet by watching what orbits around it. What orbits around it is not recovery work, it is analysis, linguistics, mathematics, signal processing. Long-term funding for antenna arrays with no published purpose. Personnel with backgrounds in cryptography and information theory attached, on paper, to an aerospace logistics office. You do not need cryptographers to pick up wreckage. You need cryptographers when something is talking. The conclusion Morgan reaches, and she reaches it slowly and reluctantly over the course of 6 years, is that the purpose of the larger program was never retrieval at all. Retrieval was housekeeping. The purpose was contact. Not the kind of contact people imagine, with landings on lawns and speeches at the United Nations. Something far less cinematic and far more bureaucratic. A long, patient, one-sided correspondence conducted across decades by a small number of people inside a system designed so that no single participant ever saw the whole shape of it. And once she accepts that, the timeline of the 13th of March stops looking like a crisis. It starts looking like an appointment. Because look at the sequence again. The corridor plan was written years earlier and maintained annually. The recovery zone was already selected. The units were already positioned. The aircraft that dropped the flares were operating on a training schedule that had been on the books for weeks. The second team, with its refrigeration units and its isolation suits, was assembled and moved with a speed that no organisation on Earth achieves from a standing start. None of that is a reaction. All of it is preparation. In the story, Sloane eventually gets a piece of paper that makes it explicit. It is a fragment of an assessment, undated, mostly redacted, and what survives is a single projection concerning an object on a determined trajectory, with an estimated atmospheric entry window and a recommended recovery footprint. The recommended footprint is the Barry Goldwater Range. The window is the second week of March, 1997. They knew it was coming. They knew roughly when. They knew roughly where. They had chosen the ground and staged the equipment and written the paperwork, and they had every reason to believe that this arrival, like every arrival before it, would happen in the dark, in an empty place, with nobody watching. There was only one variable they did not control. The object came in over Phoenix, and here is the detail that turns the whole thing over. It did not have to. Sloane works the trajectory backward with a physicist. From the direction of approach and the observed track, an object entering the atmosphere on that heading, aiming for that landing area, had an enormous range of possible paths. It could have come in from the south, over the border, over empty ground the whole way. It could have come in from the west, across the desert, and never passed over a settlement larger than a gas station. Instead, it came down the length of the state, on a slow, low, deliberate line, directly over the largest concentration of human beings within 500 miles, at an hour of the evening when the greatest possible number of them would be at home, outdoors, awake, and looking up. If you wanted to be seen by as many people as possible, and you had the entire sky to choose from, that is the path you would fly. That is what Sloane finally writes in her notebook at 2 a.m, in a hotel room in Tucson, 4 years into the work. She writes that the object wanted witnesses, and somebody else spent the rest of that night and the following 20 years making sure the witnesses could be laughed at. David Mercer gave Rebecca Sloan one more thing before he died. It was a cassette tape. He explained where it came from in the flat, unhappy voice of a man confessing to something small and stupid that turned out to matter. On the night he waited on the ground in Arizona before his cargo was loaded, he spent a period of hours in a facility where he had nothing to do. He had a small recorder with him, the kind he used to leave voice notes for himself, and at some point he left it running in his flight bag and set the bag down in a corridor outside a work area. He did it, he said, for no good reason at all. He was bored. He was uneasy. Something in the atmosphere of that night made him want a record of being there, and he could never explain the impulse better than that. He did not listen to the tape for 11 years. When he finally did, he stopped after the first pass and did not play it again. The recording is poor. There is machinery running somewhere. There is a low, constant hum, and the acoustics are hard and echoing, the sound of a large space with a concrete floor. Voices come and go as people move past the bag. For most of its length, it is meaningless. Fragments about power, about cabling, about somebody being needed at a particular door. Then there is a stretch of about 90 seconds, where a small group of people are standing close enough to be understood. The first voice is male, older, and sounds tired. He says that the hull integrity is intact. A second voice, further away, answers that the inner compartment should be opened. There is a pause. There are sounds that are difficult to identify. Something metallic, something being moved. A rising note that might be a tool or might be the recording itself failing. Then the tape goes almost silent and stays that way for a long time. Sloan measured it. 22 seconds. 22 seconds is an extraordinarily long time for a room full of working people to say nothing at all. Then a voice, closer than the others, quiet, not addressed to anyone in particular, says that there is no pilot. And a fourth voice, calm, unsurprised, and completely level, answers. He says that there never was one. Sloan plays that section perhaps 200 times over the following year. She has it analysed. She has the room's dimensions estimated from the reverberation. She has the 4 voices separated and counted. But it is not the words that convince her. It is the tone of that last answer. Because a person discovering that a craft has no pilot would sound astonished. A person who had never considered the possibility would ask a question. A person encountering the greatest surprise in the history of their species would not sound like that. The fourth voice sounds like a man confirming a delivery. There never was one, not a discovery, a correction. Somebody in that room already knew, and had known for a long time, and was gently informing a colleague who had walked in with the wrong expectations, which means the pilot was never the point. So what was? The engineering assessments Morgan eventually pieces together give an answer that is stranger than either woman anticipated. The object had no cockpit. It had no seating, no controls, no interface designed for hands or eyes, or any body of any shape. It had no propulsion system that anyone could identify, and no fuel, and no visible means of having moved at all. It had no navigation equipment. It had, in fact, almost nothing. The overwhelming majority of its internal volume was solid, not hollow, not compartmented. Solid material, arranged in that impossible lattice, doing something that nobody in 1997 could describe. And in the centre of it, there was one active component. One. It was transmitting. A narrow, low-powered, extraordinarily stable signal, aimed outward, away from Earth, on a bearing that did not vary. It required no maintenance and drew power from something nobody located. It had been transmitting when it came down. It transmitted through the recovery. It transmitted in the hangar and on Mercer's aircraft, and in whatever facility in Nevada it went to afterward. It was still transmitting decades later. The content of the signal was not language. It was mathematics, a sequence, repeating, unvarying, with a structure so simple that the cryptographers assigned to it had nothing to do within the first week. It was not a message, it was a beacon, which is where the story arrives at its final and quietest turn. Nearly 30 years after the 13th of March, 1997, Rebecca Sloan is old and tired and has published almost nothing about any of this, because at every step the evidence has been the kind that convinces the person holding it and nobody else. She has one loose end left, the signal structure, the sequence itself. She has never been able to make it mean anything, because she has been trying to read it as information, as words or coordinates, or a description of something. One night, unable to sleep, she stops trying to read it and simply plots it. Values against time, the most boring thing you can do with a data set. And the shape that appears on the page is a line, descending. The sequence is not a message. It is not a signature or a location or a greeting. The numbers are getting smaller, at a rate so slow and so exquisitely regular that across 3 decades of continuous transmission, it has moved only a fraction of the way toward its end. But it has moved. It is counting. And when she extends the line forward and finds the point where the value reaches 0, she gets a date. A specific one, not tomorrow, not next year. A date still some years out from where she sits, close enough that she can imagine the weather that day. She sits with that piece of paper for a long time, then she puts it in a drawer. She publishes nothing, not because she is afraid, though she is, a little. She publishes nothing because she has finally understood what she would be publishing, and she can think of no version of the sentence that helps anybody. 6 weeks later, an envelope arrives at her home. No return address, no note. Nothing inside but a single photograph, printed on the heavy matte stock that satellite imagery used to be printed on, with a corner of a classification stamp still visible at the edge where somebody trimmed it badly. It is a wide overhead image of a stretch of desert. Mountains at the top edge, a dry wash running diagonally, vehicle tracks converging on a single point from 3 directions. It is the recovery site. The timestamp along the border is the morning of the 14th of March, 1997. The object is not in the image. By that hour it has already been lifted, crated, driven out along a corridor that was written years in advance, and flown to Nevada by a tired man who never learned what he was carrying. The convoy is still there. She can count the vehicles. She can see the shadows they throw, long and westward, in the low early light. And beside them, perhaps 300 yards off, on open ground, there is a second shape. It is not a vehicle. It casts a shadow that does not match anything else in the frame. It is not covered, or crated, or surrounded. Nobody appears to be near it. Nobody appears to be attending to it at all. It is simply there, at the edge of the site, in the daylight, in the open, watching. So let me leave you with this. As the room goes soft around you, and the story starts to come apart into pieces, for nearly 30 years, the Phoenix Lights have been argued about as though the argument were about the lights. Were they flares, or were they something else? Were the witnesses mistaken, or were they lied to? Thousands of people, one sky, one endlessly repeating debate. According to the conspiracy, everybody has been arguing about the wrong thing the entire time. The lights were never the mystery, they were the escort. The formation that crossed Arizona that night, so silent, so perfect, so impossible to photograph properly, was not the visitor. It was the company it kept, and the thing it was surrounding was already on its way down toward a piece of sealed ground selected years earlier by people who had known the appointment was coming. And when the whole state stood in its yards and looked west at a line of burning lights hanging above the mountains, they were doing exactly what they had been arranged to do. They were looking at the sky, while the only thing that ever mattered was happening on the ground, in the dark, beyond the ridge, 300 yards from a rancher who could not sleep, inside a silence so complete that even the insects stopped. History remembers the Phoenix Lights as one of the great unexplained events in American life. According to the conspiracy, The lights were never unexplained at all. They were the camouflage. And somewhere, in a building nobody will name, in a container nobody will open, a signal that has been counting down since 1997 is still counting. Sleep well. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this content, please hit that hype points button. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a huge difference in getting these stories out to more people. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. No pressure. Alright, let's get into it. October 28th, 1955, Norfolk, Virginia. The morning shift at Betty's Diner started like any other. Coffee brewing in the big steel percolator. The smell sharp and bitter and perfect. Bacon sizzling on the griddle. Grease popping in a rhythm Betty Kowalski had known for 8 years. The familiar symphony of a working-class breakfast joint coming to life. Truck drivers at the counter nursing their first cups. Factory workers on break before the shift change. The regulars, all of them, faces Betty knew better than her own family sometimes. She knew what Tommy wanted before he sat down. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, rye toast. She knew that Margaret would order oatmeal but only eat half. She knew that the construction crew from the shipyard site would pile into the corner booth and split 3 breakfast platters between 5 men because money was tight and pride was tighter. But the man who stumbled through her door at 7:43 that Tuesday morning was not a regular. Betty noticed him immediately, the way you notice something wrong in a familiar pattern, the way a discordant note stands out in a song you've heard 1,000 times. He wore a navy pea coat, not the modern kind, not the surplus store vintage that sailors sometimes wore. This was genuinely old. The wool was thick and heavy, the kind they stopped making after the war because it cost too much and weighed too much, and modern sailors didn't need that kind of protection anymore. The buttons were tarnished brass, not the polished kind. The collar was worn smooth from years of use, decades maybe. It looked like it belonged in a museum, carefully preserved behind glass with a placard explaining what sailors wore during World War II. But this coat wasn't preserved. It was worn. Recently worn. There was lint on the shoulders, a fresh coffee stain on the cuff. It smelled like mothballs and salt air, and something else Betty couldn't quite place. Something like ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. The man's face was pale, not the healthy pale of someone who worked indoors, but the waxy pale of someone who'd been sick for a long time, or scared for a long time. His eyes were the worst part. They darted around the diner like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in details with desperate intensity. The chrome napkin dispensers, the red vinyl booth seats, the clock on the wall shaped like a coffee cup. He stared at the clock for a full 10 seconds, mouth slightly open, like he couldn't believe what it was telling him. Betty grabbed a menu and a coffee pot, put on her professional smile, the one that said she'd seen everything, and nothing surprised her anymore. She approached his booth. "Morning, hun. Coffee to start?" The man didn't answer, didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at his hands now, turning them over slowly like he was checking to make sure they were still attached. His fingers were trembling. "Sir, you okay?" Betty set the coffee pot down, genuine concern replacing the professional smile. Something was very wrong here. The man finally looked at her, his eyes focused with visible effort. "What year is it?" Betty felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the diner. 1955, she said carefully. October. The man's face did something strange. Relief and horror fighting for dominance. He laughed, but it came out wrong, like a sob disguised as laughter. 12 years, he whispered. "It's been 12 years. Before Betty could ask what he meant, the man reached into his coat with trembling hands. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated, like he was relearning how to use his arms. He pulled out a manila envelope and Betty noticed his fingernails were wrong. Too long, ragged, like he'd been scratching at something for a very long time. The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges, the kind of paper they'd used during the war when everything was rationed and nothing was wasted. "I need you to keep this," he said. His voice was hoarse, scratched raw. "They're coming. They always come. But maybe this time someone will listen. Maybe this time someone will tell the truth." Betty took the envelope because she didn't know what else to do. The paper felt strange under her fingers, too dry, too fragile. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" The man gripped her wrist suddenly with surprising strength. His skin was cold. "I was on the Eldridge, the visibility test. October 43, Philadelphia. We were there when they turned on the field. We were there when everything went wrong." The diner had gone quiet. Betty hadn't noticed when the conversation stopped, but they had. Everyone was watching now. Tommy at the counter, coffee forgotten. The construction crew, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. Margaret with her hand frozen on her water glass. All of them sensing that something was happening, something they'd tell their families about later, something that would become a story they'd repeat for years. That's when the two men in dark suits walked through the door. They didn't storm in, didn't announce themselves. They simply appeared, and the quality of the air in the diner changed. Betty would think about it later, try to explain it to the police and to herself, and eventually to the journalist who'd come asking questions. The best she could describe it was that the temperature dropped. Not, dramatically, not enough to see your breath. Just a sudden coolness, like someone had opened a freezer door somewhere nearby. The suits were unremarkable. Dark grey, well-tailored but not expensive. The kind of suits that middle management wore, the kind designed to be forgotten 5 minutes after you stopped looking at them. The men themselves were the same. Average height, average build, average faces. Betty couldn't have described them if someone put a gun to her head. Not their hair colour, not their eye colour, not a single distinguishing feature. But the sailor knew them. His entire body went rigid when he saw them. The colour drained from his already pale face. His hand released Betty's wrist and started trembling so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "They found me," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, thick with resignation and fear. "They always find us. Doesn't matter where we go. Doesn't matter how long we run. They always find us." He looked at Betty one more time and she saw tears in his eyes. "Don't let them take it. Please, don't let them bury this again. We deserve to be remembered. We deserve to be real." The men in suits moved with practiced efficiency. No badges shown, no explanations given, no acknowledgement of the other customers watching. They simply took the sailor by the arms, one on each side, and guided him toward the door. He didn't resist, didn't fight. His body went limp between them, like a puppet with cut strings. But at the door he stopped, used what must have been his last reserve of strength to turn his head, to look back at Betty one final time. "We were buried in the field," he said. His voice was clear now, carrying across the silent diner. Every person there heard it. Every person there would remember. Tell them we were buried in the field. Tell them we were real. Tell them we existed. Then he was gone. The suits, the sailor, all of it disappeared through the door. Betty rushed to the window in time to see a black sedan pull away from the curb. She looked for the license plate, some detail to report, to hold on to, to prove this had actually happened. There was no plate, just smooth metal where the plate should have been. The diner stayed quiet for a long moment. Then everyone started talking at once. What was that? Who were those men? Should someone call the police? Did you see his face? Did you hear what he said? The questions overlapped, voices rising, everyone trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Betty stood there with the envelope in her hands, feeling its impossible lightness, its terrible weight. She looked down at it. The handwriting on the front was shaky, written by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. To whoever finds this, we were there. We were buried in the field. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were 3 items, each one a small piece of impossible truth. First, a photograph. Black and white, the edges worn soft from handling. A naval destroyer photographed from the dock, the morning sun catching the grey paint of her hull. The image was slightly out of focus, taken quickly, without time for proper framing, but the hull number was clear. DE-173. Betty didn't know ships, didn't know naval designations, but she knew numbers, and these numbers were stamped clearly on the bow, the USS Eldridge. Second, a slip of paper with coordinates written in the same trembling hand. Numbers and letters that meant nothing to Betty, but would later be identified by people who understood such things as coordinates, marking waters off the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Third, a date. Just a date. Written larger than the coordinates, underlined 3 times like the writer had wanted to make absolutely sure it couldn't be missed or misunderstood. October the 28th, 1943. Betty looked at the calendar behind her counter. October the 28th, 1955. Exactly 12 years to the day. The sailor's words echoed in her mind. It's been 12 years. She didn't know about the Philadelphia experiment, didn't know the legends, the stories, the whispered rumours that had circulated among certain circles for years. She was a diner owner in Norfolk, Virginia, not a conspiracy theorist, not someone who paid attention to fringe theories about government experiments and wartime secrets. But she knew someone who did pay attention to those things. There was a journalist who'd been coming to the diner for the past few months. Always ordered the same thing, coffee and pie, whatever pie was fresh that day. Always sat in the corner booth with a notebook and a pile of government documents. Always asked questions. Careful questions, polite questions. Questions designed not to spook people but to extract information. He'd been asking about the war, about experiments, about naval facilities and classified programs and sailors who came back different, changed, wrong somehow. Betty had paid attention because that's what diner owners do. They listen. They remember. They connect dots that other people miss. His name was Henry Lockwood, and this envelope would consume the next decade of his life. Act 1. The real history. Henry Lockwood had always been drawn to the stories that lived in the margins, not the headline news, not the official narratives that appeared in polished columns under bylines that people recognised. He chased the stories that made editors uncomfortable, that required more verification than seemed worthwhile, that opened doors to rooms most people preferred to keep locked. He'd started his career covering local corruption in Philadelphia, the kind of grinding investigative work that involved months in dusty archives and interviews with people who spoke in whispers and looked over their shoulders. Then came the war, and Henry had tried to enlist. Flat feet and asthma kept him stateside, kept him watching from a distance as other men his. Age shipped out to Europe and the Pacific, so he'd found another way to serve, covered the home front, the factories, the shipyards, the training facilities, started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Workers at the Philadelphia Naval Yard who wouldn't talk about certain projects, scientists who appeared on personnel lists but whose work was never described, budget allocations that went to programs with no official names. After the war, he'd pivoted to covering what came next, Operation Paperclip, the government's recruitment of Nazi scientists. He'd broken a story about a rocket engineer who'd used slave labour and was now living comfortably in Huntsville, Alabama, building missiles for the army. The story had gotten him death threats and a Peabody nomination in the same week. By the time Betty Kowalski called him about the envelope, Henry Lockwood was exactly the kind of journalist that government agencies watched carefully and ordinary sources trusted implicitly. He'd earned a reputation for protecting his sources, for getting details right, for not publishing until he was absolutely certain. He drove to Norfolk the same day Betty called, listened to her story, took notes in his precise shorthand, asked clarifying questions that revealed he was taking this seriously. He examined the envelope, the photograph, the coordinates, the date. Didn't dismiss it, didn't jump to conclusions, just absorbed the information with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the truth usually hid in details other people overlooked. "Tell me about the sailor," Henry said, pen poised over his notebook. "Physical description, anything distinctive you remember." Betty described the peacoat, the pale face, the wrong fingernails, the way he'd asked what year it was, the terror when he saw the men in suits. "And the suits," Henry pressed. "Can you describe them?" "That's the thing," Betty said. "I can't. I saw them. We all saw them. But I couldn't tell you what they looked like. Average everything. Forgettable on purpose." Henry wrote that down, underlined it twice. Forgettable on purpose. That was interesting. That suggested training, methodology, purpose. The Philadelphia experiment was not new to Henry. He'd encountered references to it over the years, whispers in the same circles that talked about UFOs and mind control, and other fringe topics that serious journalists learned to avoid. The story went that in October 1943, the Navy had conducted an experiment in invisibility, trying to make the USS Eldridge disappear from enemy radar. Depending on who told the story, the ship had either vanished completely, teleported to Norfolk, or opened a portal to another dimension. It was the kind of story that sounded like science fiction, the kind that legitimate sources denied and conspiracy theorists embraced. Henry had always filed it in the same mental category as alien autopsies and faked moon landings. Interesting, maybe based, on a kernel of truth somewhere, but ultimately unprovable and not worth his limited time. But this envelope changed things. Not because it proved the experiment happened, but because someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to deliver this information. Someone had been scared enough, desperate enough to walk into a random diner and hand classified material to a stranger, and someone else had cared enough to send suits to retrieve that person within minutes. That suggested the story wasn't just fringe theory. It suggested there was something real underneath the legend, something worth protecting, something worth covering up. Henry started with the basics. The photograph showed the USS Eldridge. That much was verifiable. He travelled to Washington, to the Naval History and Heritage Command, the repository of Navy records and documentation, filed the proper requests, showed the proper credentials, and gained access to the official record of the USS Eldridge. The ship was real. Cannon-class destroyer escort, hull number DE-173. Commissioned on August 27, 1943 at the Newark shipyard of the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. Standard armament for the class, designed for anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort duty. Crew complement of approximately 215 officers and men. The official record showed routine service, shakedown cruise, equipment trials, convoy duty in the Atlantic, Mediterranean operations in 44 and 45, survival of the war, transfer to Greece in 51 as part of the military assistance program, renamed Leon, continued service in the Hellenic Navy until decommissioning in the early 70s. Nothing unusual, nothing classified, just another warship with an unremarkable history written in bureaucratic precision. But Henry had learned to read between the lines of official records. He'd learned that what wasn't said was often more important than what was. And the deck logs for October 1943 had some very interesting omissions. Every naval vessel kept detailed daily logs, position reports, weather observations, activities, drills, personnel changes, equipment maintenance. The logs were supposed to be comprehensive, a minute-by-minute record of shipboard life that would allow historians to reconstruct exactly what happened on any given day. Henry had read hundreds of deck logs in his career. He knew the rhythm of them, the the standardised language, the level of detail that was considered normal. The Eldridge's logs for September and November 1943 matched that standard. Position fixes given to the minute, activities described in detail, weather recorded multiple times per day. But October was different. The entries were sparse, vague in a way that felt deliberately vague. Position reports gave general areas instead of specific coordinates. East Coast operations instead of exact latitude and longitude. Activities were summarised instead of detailed. Equipment trials and maintenance, instead of descriptions of what equipment was being tested or what maintenance was being performed. And for October 28th, the date on the envelope, the date the sailor had mentioned, the entire entry read, routine maintenance and equipment testing, Brooklyn Navy Yard, no incidents to report. Henry stared at that entry for a long time. No incidents to report was an interesting phrase. It wasn't standard log language. Usually if nothing notable happened, you simply didn't mention it. You listed the routine activities and moved on. But no incidents to report suggested that someone had anticipated there might be incidents, had specifically wanted to make clear for the record that there had not been incidents, had used language that almost invited speculation about what those incidents might have been. It was the kind of phrase that appeared after investigations, after questions from higher up the chain of command, after someone had demanded clarification about something that may or may not have happened. Henry photographed the logs, requested copies through official channels, and started digging into what the Navy had actually been working on in October 1943. World War II had accelerated technological development in ways that were hard to overstate. Radar, sonar, proximity fuses, jet engines, atomic weapons. The line between science fiction and science fact had blurred almost completely. If you'd told someone in 1935 that in 10 years there would be flying bombs, self-guided torpedoes, and weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion, they would have laughed at you. By 1943, the impossible had become routine. Scientists and engineers were pushing boundaries that had seemed inviolable just years earlier. And the Navy, facing submarine warfare that was bleeding the Atlantic supply lines, was willing to try almost anything that might give them an edge. Degaussing was real. Henry found extensive documentation about it. The technique involved wrapping ships in electromagnetic coils that would neutralize the vessel's magnetic signature, protecting against magnetic mines and making submarine detection more difficult. It was standard technology by mid-war, installed on hundreds of ships, completely unclassified. Radar countermeasures were real. Early attempts to reduce radar cross-section, experimental coatings and hull modifications, anything that might make a ship harder to detect on enemy screens. Some of it worked, some of it didn't, but the research was extensive and mostly documented. But then Henry found something that made him pause. Buried in a filing cabinet in the Office of Naval Research Archives, yellowed and forgotten, was a memo dated April 1957, 14 years after the alleged experiment. The subject line read, "Response to inquiry regarding alleged teleportation. Experiment, USS Eldridge, October 1943." Henry's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the document. The memo was brief, written in the clipped bureaucratic language that characterized official denials. It acknowledged that rumours had been circulating about an invisibility or teleportation experiment. It stated clearly and unequivocally that no such experiment had occurred, that the technology required for such an experiment did not exist in 1943 and still did not exist in 1957. But then came the final paragraph, the one that Henry read 3 times to make sure he was understanding it correctly. However, it should be noted that electromagnetic field research was conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the relevant time period. Said research was classified under Project Rainbow and related to degaussing and countermeasure development. While no experiments involving teleportation or invisibility occurred, the presence of this research and the associated equipment installations may have contributed to misunderstandings among personnel not briefed on the program's actual purpose. All records related to Project Rainbow remain classified and are not available for public review. Project Rainbow. Henry felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't a complete denial. This was an acknowledgement disguised as a denial. The Navy was admitting that classified electromagnetic research had been conducted at Philadelphia in October 43. They were admitting the research was significant enough to still be classified 14 years later. They were even admitting that the research might have been mysterious enough to confuse people who saw it. What they weren't doing was explaining what Project Rainbow actually was. Henry spent the next month searching for anything related to Project Rainbow. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewed retired naval officers, traced budget allocations through congressional records. Most of what he found was redacted or missing, pages removed from files with notes saying classified material removed or transferred to secure storage. But he did find one interesting connection. Rainbow was indeed a real naval code name, used not just for one project but as an umbrella designation for multiple countermeasure research programs. Radar jamming, magnetic camouflage, acoustic deception, anything designed to make enemy detection more difficult or confused. Which raised an obvious question. If Rainbow was just a code name for conventional countermeasure research, why was it still classified in 1957? Degassing was public knowledge. Radar jamming was public knowledge. What exactly had the Rainbow program been working on that still couldn't be revealed more than a decade after the war ended? Henry's next lead came from the Philadelphia experiment's most famous witness, a man named Carl Meredith Allen. Sometimes he went by Carlos Allende, sometimes just Carlos Allen. He'd sent letters to the Office of Naval Research in the 1950s claiming to have witnessed the experiment firsthand. Henry had read copies of those letters years ago, when he first encountered the Philadelphia experiment story. They were strange documents, rambling and marginalia-filled, written in a distinctive style that mixed technical language with mystical speculation. Allen claimed he'd been serving on a merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, and had watched the Eldridge disappear from Philadelphia and reappear in Norfolk. The Navy had dismissed the letters as crackpot nonsense. Henry had initially agreed. But after finding the Project Rainbow memo, he decided to track down Allen's surviving family and see if there was anything more to the story. Allen had died in 1994, but his sister still lived outside Philadelphia. Henry called her, explained he was researching wartime naval operations, mentioned her brother's name carefully, watching for her reaction. There was a long silence on the phone. Then, "You're the first person to ask about Carl in years. Most people think he was crazy." "Was he?" Henry asked gently. Another pause. "I don't know. He saw something. Something that scared him for the rest of his life. Whether it was what he claimed it was, I can't say. But he wasn't lying. He believed every word he wrote." Henry drove to Pennsylvania the next day. Allen's sister Margaret met him at a coffee shop. She was in her 70s, cautious, protective of her brother's memory, but also tired of carrying the burden of his obsession alone. He started talking about it in the late 40s, Margaret explained, would wake up from nightmares, describing this green light, this horrible humming sound. He'd draw diagrams of ships surrounded by coils, said the Navy was experimenting with things they didn't understand, that they'd opened something they couldn't close. Did he keep any records, notes, journals, anything? Margaret hesitated. He kept a diary, made me promise not to let anyone see it while he was alive. Said it was too dangerous, but he's been gone for years now, and I'm old. I'd rather someone knew the truth, whatever the truth is, than let it die with me. She went to her car, returned with a leather-bound journal. The cover was water-stained, the pages yellowed. The title on the first page, written in careful script, Project Rainbow Observations. Henry's pulse quickened. Carl Allen, the supposed crackpot, had used the exact code name that appeared in classified Navy documents. A code name that wasn't public knowledge in the 1950s. A code name he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd actually encountered it somewhere. Somehow. "May I make copies?" Henry asked. Margaret nodded. "That's why I brought it. I want someone to know. I want someone to care." Henry spent 3 days going through the diary, photographing every page, taking notes, cross-referencing details with what he'd already learned. The journal was exactly as strange as Alan's letters had been. Parts of it were lucid, detailed observations of ships and dates and locations. Other parts devolved into paranoid speculation about government surveillance and parallel dimensions. But scattered throughout were specific technical details that felt authentic. References to electromagnetic coils and vacuum tubes, descriptions of equipment being transferred from Philadelphia to Brooklyn in late October 1943. Mentions of scientists and mathematicians working on classified Navy projects. And one entry, dated November 1943, that made Henry stop breathing for a moment. Met a sailor today outside a bar in Philadelphia. He approached me when he saw my merchant marine jacket. Said he'd been on the Eldridge during the test. Wouldn't give his name. Said they'd been ordered not to talk, that there would be consequences if anyone found out. But he was scared. Needed to tell someone. Described the field activation, the green-blue light that surrounded the ship. The way the air seemed to crack and fold. He said it worked at first. Said the ship actually disappeared from view. But then something went wrong. The field became unstable. Some of the crew started hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. Others experienced time skipping forward in jumps, missing minutes. He said 2 men walked through a bulkhead without meaning to, just stepped forward and passed through solid steel like it wasn't there. When the field finally collapsed and they could see properly again, one of those men was embedded in the metal. They had to cut him out. He died screaming. The Navy called it a training accident, but it wasn't an accident. It was the field. The field did something to reality itself. The sailor said the surviving crew members were examined by Navy doctors who diagnosed them with disorientation, sensory confusion, temporary psychological breaks. But he said it was more than that. Said they'd gone somewhere else during the test, brought something back with them. Something that watched them. Something that followed them. He begged me not to tell anyone. Said if I cared about him, I'd forget we ever talked. Then he left. I never saw him again. If anyone ever asks, I'll say this conversation never happened. But I'm writing it here because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that we're not alone in the world. There are spaces between spaces, and the Navy opened a door to one of those spaces in October 1943. ASTI 2, the first cracks in the story. The coordinates from the envelope led Henry to the Delaware River, to a section of waterfront that had once been part of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The facility had been decommissioned decades ago, its functions transferred to other locations, its real estate carved up and sold off. What had been a vital military installation was now a patchwork of commercial developments, industrial parks, and empty lots waiting for the next round of redevelopment. But this particular stretch of waterfront was different. Henry noticed it as soon as he pulled up. On either side, development had marched forward aggressively. New condominiums, office buildings, warehouses. But here, a gap. A stretch of perhaps 200 yards that had been left completely untouched. Chain-link fence, rust-stained and sagging. Warning signs faded to illegibility. Beyond the fence, nothing but weeds and crumbling concrete and the slow reclamation of nature. It was the kind of gap that raised questions. Why hadn't this land been developed? Who owned it? Why was it sitting empty while valuable waterfront property elsewhere sold for premium prices? Henry had learned to notice gaps like this. They were the bureaucratic equivalent of redacted text in documents. Spaces where something should be but wasn't. Absences that drew attention by their very emptiness. He parked his car, grabbed his camera, and found a spot where the fence had rusted through enough to slip past. The ground beyond was uneven, concrete broken and heaved by years of freeze-thaw cycles. Rebar jutted from the ground at angles. Old machinery parts lay half buried in dirt and vegetation. The coordinates led him to what had once been a pier. The structure itself was mostly gone. Wooden pilings rotted away to stumps, decking collapsed into the river. But the foundations remained. Massive concrete mooring points, built to last decades, maybe centuries. The kind of permanent infrastructure the military installed when they expected to use a facility for a very long time. Henry walked the length of what had been the pier, photographing everything, taking measurements, trying to reconstruct what the facility would have looked like in 1943, and that's when he saw the sign. It was mounted on one of the concrete mooring points, barely visible under decades of grime and corrosion, a metal plaque, the kind the military used for designation markers. Henry almost missed it. Would have missed it if the afternoon sun hadn't caught the metal at just the right angle. He scraped at the surface with his car keys, clearing away enough dirt to read the text. The lettering was still sharp, stamped deep into the metal. Restricted area, authorized personnel only, authorization code, Rainbow 1943. Henry's hands were shaking as he photographed the sign. Here it was. Physical evidence, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Project Rainbow hadn't been a filing error or a coincidental code name. It had been significant enough to designate an entire section of the naval shipyard. Significant enough to require specific authorization codes. Significant enough to restrict access, even during a war when security was paramount everywhere. He spent the next hour searching the area for anything else that might have survived. And what he found made his skin prickle despite the summer heat. Scorch marks on the concrete. Not fire damage. Not the kind of charring you'd expect from industrial accidents or wartime activity. These were different. Circular patterns, perfectly symmetrical, radiating out from a central point like someone had drawn them with a giant compass. The marks were deep, the concrete itself altered in ways that shouldn't be possible. Henry crouched down, ran his fingers over the scorched surface. The concrete felt smooth, almost glassy in places, like it had been melted and then rapidly cooled. The pattern repeated multiple times across the pier foundation, always the same circular shape, always radiating from a central point. He photographed the marks from multiple angles, measured their dimensions, collected samples of the affected concrete by chipping off small pieces and sealing them in evidence bags. Later, he'd have them analysed by a materials engineer at MIT who owed him a favour. The engineer's report would arrive 3 weeks later, and it would raise more questions than it answered. The concrete had been exposed to sustained temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the heat hadn't come from conventional sources. The damage pattern suggested electromagnetic heating, like what you'd see in an induction furnace, but on a massive scale and applied in precise circular patterns. "I've never seen anything like this," the engineer wrote in his analysis. The precision required to create these patterns, the heat levels needed, the fact that it's focused in such specific areas while leaving surrounding concrete untouched. Whatever caused this, it wasn't conventional technology. At least not any conventional technology I'm aware of. And the really strange part? Based on the depth of heat penetration into the concrete, this happened all at once. Not over time, not from repeated exposure. Someone or something applied massive electromagnetic energy in a single event, and these marks are what remains. But Henry didn't have that analysis yet as he stood on the abandoned pier in the fading afternoon light. All he had were strange scorch marks and a growing certainty that something significant had happened here. Something that the official record had carefully avoided documenting. Back in the archives, Henry focused on the Eldridge's movements during October 1943. The official record said the ship had spent most of that month in New York, conducting trials and equipment installation at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Standard procedure for a newly commissioned vessel. Nothing unusual about that. But Henry had learned to look at not just what was recorded, but how it was recorded. And the transfer logs for that period had some interesting anomalies. Standard naval procedure required detailed manifests for any equipment transfer. What was being moved, why it was being moved, who authorised the transfer, where it came from, where it was going. The Navy was obsessive about documentation. Everything had to be tracked, verified, receipted. It was how the military prevented theft, ensured accountability, maintained the paper trail that bureaucracies required to function. But on October 26, 1943, there was an entry in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard transfer logs that violated all those standard procedures. Special equipment transfer to Brooklyn Naval Yard. Authorization code Rainbow. No manifest required. Classification level restricted. Transfer completion to be confirmed by receiving facility. No manifest required. That was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Equipment transfers without manifests were rare, reserved for highly classified material that couldn't be described in standard documentation, but the classification level being listed as restricted rather than using standard designations like confidential, secret or top secret was even stranger. Restricted suggested a compartmentalized program, something so sensitive that standard classification levels didn't apply. The transfer was logged as complete on October 29th, 1 day after the date on the envelope, 1 day after the alleged experiment. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Henry tried to find records of what had been transferred, who had authorized it, where the equipment had come from, where it had gone after arriving in Brooklyn. Every angle he pursued led to the same dead end. Missing files, redacted documents, transfer records that had been removed from archives with notes saying classified material relocated to secure storage, or simply file not found. It was a pattern he'd seen before, the bureaucratic equivalent of burning evidence. You couldn't make records disappear completely, that would be too obvious. But you could scatter them, classify them at different levels, move them to facilities with restricted access, essentially bury them so deep that finding all the pieces became effectively impossible. But sometimes pieces survived in unexpected places. Henry found one such piece in a budget report for the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard Research Division. It was routine financial documentation, the kind of mundane paperwork that got filed and forgotten because no one imagined it would ever be interesting. But buried in a list of consultant payments for the fall of 1943 was an entry that made Henry lean closer to the microfilm reader. Consultant Services, Civilian Mathematician, 3 days, October 25 through October 27, Philadelphia Facilities, Classification Restricted, Payment processed through ONR Special Projects account. The consultant's name was redacted, but the file reference number included initials, JVN John von Neumann. It had to be. How many civilian mathematicians with those initials would have been consulting for the Navy in October 1943? How many would have been working on projects classified at special restricted levels? John von Neumann was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, polymath. He'd worked on the Manhattan Project, contributed to quantum mechanics, pioneered game theory, helped develop the first programmable computers. If there had been a classified Navy project involving advanced physics and electromagnetic theory in 1943, von Neumann would have been exactly the kind of person they'd bring in as a consultant. And the dates: October 25th through 27th, 3 days that ended 1 day before the alleged experiment on October 28th. Von Neumann would have left Philadelphia just as the test was being prepared, having provided the mathematical framework, the theoretical foundation, whatever expertise the Navy needed to attempt something unprecedented. Henry tried to find more information about von Neumann's work for the Navy in 1943. Hit the same walls he'd hit with everything else related to Project Rainbow. Redacted files, missing records, vague references to classified consulting work with no details about what that work entailed. But he had the initials, he had the dates, he had evidence that one of the world's leading mathematicians had been in Philadelphia, working on a restricted project right before the alleged experiment. The pieces were starting to connect, not conclusively, not in a way that would convince skeptics, but enough to show a pattern. Enough to suggest that something real had happened beneath the layers of denial and misdirection. Henry knew he needed more. Documents and dates were important, but they could be explained away. He needed witnesses. People who'd been there, who'd seen what happened, who could provide first-hand testimony that matched the documentary evidence. Finding those witnesses would prove to be the hardest part of the investigation, and the most disturbing. Act 3. What really happened in 1943. Finding witnesses to something that officially never happened was like trying to reconstruct a photograph that had been deliberately torn into pieces and scattered. Henry started with the Eldridge's crew manifest. the official list of officers and enlisted men who'd served on the ship during her commissioning and early operations. Most of them were dead. 70 years had passed. The youngest would be in their late 80s or early 90s now. Heart disease, cancer, accidents, the simple attrition of time. Henry cross-referenced the manifest with veteran death records, tracked down obituaries, built a database of who'd survived and where they might be found. Out of a crew of 215, he found 37 men still alive. He started calling, introduced himself as a journalist researching naval operations during World War II, asked if they'd be willing to talk about their service. Most conversations ended quickly. Not interested. Don't remember much. Too old for this. Click. Henry expected that. People got tired of talking about the war. Memories faded. Some wounds never healed enough to discuss casually with strangers, but some reactions were different, more pointed. As soon as Henry mentioned the Eldridge in October 1943, the conversation changed. I can't help you. I don't know anything about that. You should talk to the Navy if you have questions. Click. Those reactions were interesting. Not I don't remember, but I can't help you. Not forgetfulness, but unwillingness. Like they'd been told not to talk. Like they were still following orders from 7 decades ago. Then Henry expanded his search. He started looking not just at Eldridge crew members, but at sailors who'd been stationed at the Philadelphia or Brooklyn naval yards during October 1943. Men who might have seen something, witnessed something, even if they hadn't been directly involved. That's how he found Edward Ryan. Ryan had served on the USS Engstrom, another destroyer escort that had been in Philadelphia for trials and equipment installation at the same time as the Eldridge. When Henry called, Ryan didn't hang up, didn't give an immediate refusal. Instead, there was a long silence after Henry mentioned the Eldridge's name. Finally Ryan spoke. His voice was quiet, careful. I was wondering when someone would finally ask about that. Been carrying it for 70 years. Figured I'd die with it. Maybe that would be easier. Would you be willing to meet in person? Henry asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. Another pause. Yes, but not over the phone, and not where anyone will see us. I don't know if they still watch, but I'm not taking chances. They met 3 days later at Ryan's house in Rhode Island, a small ranch-style home near the coast. The walls were decorated with naval memorabilia. Photos of ships, deployment certificates, shadow boxes containing medals and ribbons. The proud displays of a career sailor who'd served honourably and remembered that service with satisfaction. But there were no photos of the Engstrom. Henry noticed that. The ship Ryan had served on during the exact period they were about to discuss was absent from all the carefully curated displays. Ryan made coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Not palsy, not age-related tremor. The trembling of someone who was nervous, scared maybe. Finally about to share something he'd kept secret for most of his life. They sat at his kitchen table. Henry set up his tape recorder, asked permission to record. Ryan nodded. Might as well. If I'm going to do this, might as well do it properly. Tell me about October 1943, Henry began. Ryan took a sip of coffee, stared out the window at the ocean, started talking. We were docked at Philadelphia for equipment installation. The Engstrom was new, still getting fitted out, with all the gear we'd need for convoy duty. Radar, sonar, depth charges, all the standard stuff. We were scheduled to be there for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Routine work. The Eldridge was there too, further down the pier. She was newer than us, commissioned just a couple of months earlier. I remember seeing her arrive because she had all this special equipment being installed. Big coils, massive generators, cables everywhere. They put up fencing around her berth, posted guards. That wasn't unusual. Lots of ships got special equipment back then. Classified stuff we weren't supposed to know about, so we didn't pay much attention. Ryan paused, his hands tightening around the coffee mug. October 28th. Clear day, good weather. I was on deck that afternoon doing routine maintenance, checking ropes, inspecting fittings, the kind of busy work they give sailors when there's not enough real work to keep everyone occupied. That's when I heard it. This sound. Not an engine, not machinery. Something else. High-pitched, almost beyond hearing, but you could feel it more than hear it. Made my teeth hurt, made my bones vibrate. I looked over at the Eldridge to see where it was coming from. The sound was coming from her, from those coils they'd installed. They were active, glowing slightly like they were heating up. And then there was light. Ryan stopped, took another sip of coffee. His hands were shaking harder now. What kind of light? Henry prompted gently. Green-blue, like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Not like fire, not like electricity. Something else. It started as a shimmer around the ship, like heat waves on a summer day. But then it got thicker, more solid. Like fog, but not fog because you could see through it, but also couldn't see through it at the same time. The light wrapped around the Eldridge, covered her completely. And then... Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper. Then she wasn't there anymore. I don't mean she disappeared like magic. I mean 1 second I was looking at a destroyer escort, and the next second I was looking at empty water. The moorings were still there. The gangplanks were still there, leading to nothing. The fencing, the guards, the equipment on the dock, all of it still there. But no ship. I thought I was losing my mind. Looked around, saw other sailors on deck, saw the same confusion on their faces. We were all seeing it, all seeing nothing where a 300-foot warship should have been. How long was she gone? Henry asked. Maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. Hard to say. Time felt wrong, stretched out. Then the light appeared again, and the ship came back. Just materialised out of nothing, exactly where she'd been, like she'd never left. But something was different. Even from my ship I could see something was wrong. Men running on deck, officers shouting, and this sound, this screaming. Not scared screaming, not pain screaming. Something worse, like the sound someone makes when they've seen something that broke their understanding of reality. The guards rushed in, started clearing everyone away. Officers came running from the shipyard offices. We were ordered below deck immediately, told not to discuss what we'd seen, told it was a classified test and talking about it would be considered treason. Next day, the Eldridge was gone. Moved to Brooklyn, they said. Emergency transfer for additional equipment installation. And anyone who'd been on deck during the test, anyone who'd seen what happened, got called in for medical evaluation. Ryan pulled out an old folder, the kind veterans kept with their discharge papers and service records. Inside was a medical form, yellowed with age, dated October 31st, 1943. Henry read the diagnosis. Severe disorientation, sensory confusion, temporary vision disruption. Recommend observation for possible neurological effects from equipment malfunction exposure. Equipment malfunction, Ryan said bitterly. That's what they called it. An equipment malfunction that made a ship disappear. An equipment malfunction that scrambled the minds of everyone who saw it. They examined all of us. Physical exams, neurological tests, psychological evaluations. Asked the same questions over and over. What did you see? What do you remember? Are you experiencing headaches, nausea, disorientation? They had experts explain it to us. Scientists with charts and equations. Made it sound perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. Some kind of optical phenomenon created by the experimental equipment. A mass hallucination caused by electromagnetic interference with brain function. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that actually happened. But it wasn't an optical phenomenon. I know what I saw, and I know what happened to the other men who were there. 7 of us total from the Engstrom were on deck that afternoon. 3 of them had complete nervous breakdowns within a month, had to be medically discharged, spent time in naval psychiatric facilities. 2 more committed suicide before the war ended. The Navy said it was combat stress, coincidence, the normal toll of warfare. But I knew different. Those men were fine before the test. Strong, stable, good sailors. What they saw that day broke something in them. What about you? Henry asked quietly. How did you cope? Ryan was silent for a long moment. I started drinking, heavily. It took me years to stop. Even now, I have nightmares. Not about combat, not about anything else from the war. Just that green light. That impossible moment when reality stopped making sense. I wake up and I can still feel it. That wrongness. like the world around me is just a thin shell over something vast and incomprehensible. What do you think happened? Henry asked. Honestly? Ryan looked him in the eye. I think they were trying to make the ship invisible to radar. Maybe to the naked eye too. I think they succeeded. And I think, whatever method they used had effects they didn't anticipate, didn't understand, couldn't control. That's what I think happened. They tore a hole in something, opened a door that should have stayed closed, and they couldn't close it properly. Henry left Rhode Island with the tape recording, the medical document, and a list of names. Ryan had given him other sailors who'd been in Philadelphia that day, men who might still be alive, who might be willing to talk. The second witness Henry tracked down was Michael Torres. Unlike Ryan, Torres hadn't been in Philadelphia at all. He'd been stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, serving on a supply ship, 500 miles away from the alleged experiment. But Torres had his own story, and it matched the legend in ways that made Henry's hand shake as he took notes. They spoke over the phone. Torres lived in Arizona now, far from any ocean, far from anything that might remind him of his Navy service. He sounded wary when he answered, but something in Henry's questions made him decide to talk. October 28th, 1943, Torres began. We were loading cargo at the Norfolk docks. Standard supply run, nothing unusual. Around 2 in the afternoon, someone started shouting, pointing at the harbour. There was a ship there, just appeared. Didn't sail in, didn't come from anywhere we could see. It was just suddenly there in the middle of the harbour where no ship had been seconds before. I saw the hull number, D173, the USS Eldridge. I remember because one of our officers checked the fleet positions, got on the radio, started asking what the hell a destroyer escort was doing in Norfolk when she was supposed to be in Philadelphia. The ship looked wrong. That's the best way I can describe it. The outline was sharp, but somehow blurred at the same time, like looking at something through water or heat shimmer, and there was this green tint to the air around it, this glow that didn't come from any source I could identify. We watched it for maybe 10 minutes. Everyone on the dock stopped working, just stared. Then it vanished, same way it appeared, just gone like it had never been there. When our officer finally got through to Philadelphia Naval Yard, they confirmed the Eldridge was there, had been there all day, never left. But I saw it. We all saw it. A ship can't be in 2 places at once, unless something impossible happened. Henry pulled up the Navy cargo logs for Norfolk on October 28th. He'd checked them before, found nothing unusual in the official entries, but this time he looked more carefully at the handwritten notes in the margins, the unofficial comments that dock workers sometimes scribbled. One entry, logged at 1400 hours, right around the time Torres described. The official entry was routine, standard harbour operations, loading and unloading, nothing noteworthy. But in the margin, in barely legible handwriting, unexpected hull presence. Detected, approximate location Pier 7. No identification available. No record of scheduled arrival. Duration approximately 10 minutes. Phenomenon unexplained. Recommend further investigation. No ship name attached, but the timing matched perfectly. The location matched perfectly. And the language, unexpected hull presence, suggested radar or visual detection of something that shouldn't have been there. The Philadelphia experiment legend had always claimed the Eldridge disappeared from Philadelphia and reappeared in Norfolk. Henry had dismissed that as embellishment, the kind of detail that got added to stories over time, but here was evidence, not conclusive but compelling, that something matching that description had actually occurred. Henry found one more piece of evidence before moving to the next phase of his investigation, and it was the most disturbing thing he'd discovered yet. In a box of declassified documents from the Office of Naval Research Photographic Archives, buried among hundreds of unremarkable images, he found a photograph stamped with a classification level that had been downgraded to unclassified in 1990. The date on the stamp, October the 1943. The source, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The image was blurry, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed the deck of a ship, metal structures, equipment. And in the foreground, partially obscured by what might have been smoke or fog or some kind of distortion field, was something that looked disturbingly like a human shape. But the shape wasn't standing on the deck. It was embedded in the metal, fused into the steel plating. The outline was clear enough: arms extended, torso twisted, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Like someone had been walking forward when the metal suddenly became solid around them, trapping them permanently in the structure of the ship itself. Henry stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to find some other explanation. A trick of light and shadow, an artifact of the photographic process, anything other than what it appeared to be. He brought the image to the Navy archivist who'd been helping him access documents, showed it without comment, waited for a reaction. The archivist's face went pale. He looked at the file number, looked at Henry, looked back at the photograph. "This file was misfiled," he said quietly. "This shouldn't be in the declassified archives. It should never have been accessible to public research. You need to return it immediately." "What is it?" Henry asked. "What am I looking at?" The archivist wouldn't answer, just kept repeating that the file needed to be returned, that Henry hadn't seen it, that some things remained classified for very good reasons, and this was one of them. But Henry had already photographed it, already made copies, already secured the evidence in multiple locations so it couldn't simply disappear. He left the archives knowing he'd crossed a line. The investigation was no longer theoretical. He had witnesses, he had documents, he had physical evidence, and he had a photograph that suggested something truly horrific had happened aboard the USS Eldridge in October 1943. Now he needed to know what happened after, how the Navy had responded, what they'd done to contain the situation, and whether the experiment had truly ended, or if it had simply gone underground, hidden where no one would think to look. The answer to those questions would prove more disturbing than anything he'd discovered so far, to be continued in Part 2. The Men Who Didn't Return. Part 2. The Cover-Up Act E. 4. The Cover-Up. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Henry had been investigating government cover-ups long enough to recognise the fingerprints of institutional misdirection. It wasn't aggressive suppression, it wasn't men in black threatening witnesses or breaking into offices to steal files. That would be too obvious, too dramatic, too likely to draw attention. Instead, it was subtle, bureaucratic, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Documents that should exist but didn't. Files misfiled in ways that made them effectively impossible to locate. Witnesses who couldn't quite remember or weren't quite sure. Evidence that existed but couldn't be verified or authenticated through normal channels. The Philadelphia experiment wasn't buried under threats and intimidation. It was buried under confusion and plausible deniability. Henry noticed it first with the deck logs. He'd photographed the USS Eldridge's logs for October 1943, noted how sparse and vague they were compared to other months. But when he examined the physical documents more closely, comparing them to logs from September and November, he found something interesting. The paper was different. The September and November logs were written on standard Navy issue forms from 1943. Slightly yellowed, consistent aging, the paper quality matching other wartime documents. But the October logs used different paper, whiter, crisper, the kind of stock that came into use in the early 50s. The typewriter font was different too. September and November used one style, slightly faded, the letters showing the wear patterns of a machine that had seen heavy use. October used a different typewriter entirely, the letters sharper, more uniform, newer. Henry photographed the differences, brought them to a documents examiner he'd worked with on previous investigations. The examiner confirmed what Henry suspected. The October logs had been retyped sometime in the early 1950s, transferred from original documents onto new paper using a different typewriter. "Why would they do that?" the examiner asked. "To change the content," Henry said, "or to remove details that were in the originals. You retype the logs, include only what you want preserved, destroy the originals, and claim the new versions are the real record." He checked the archive transferred documents, found a notation that the original October 43 logs had been marked as damaged and illegible in January 1952. They'd been retyped for preservation purposes, and the originals had been listed as unable to locate in subsequent inventory checks. 9 years after the alleged experiment, someone had gone through the Eldridge's records and systematically replaced the October logs with sanitized versions. Not destroyed them completely, that would raise too many questions. Just retyped them, made them vaguer, removed whatever specific details had been in the originals. Then Henry found the memo. It was buried in the Office of Naval Research Files dated November 1955, just weeks after the sailor had stumbled into Betty's diner in Norfolk. The timing couldn't be coincidental. The memo was brief, marked for limited distribution to facility commanders and security officers. The subject line read, "Guidance regarding Project Rainbow inquiries. Recent unauthorized disclosures have resulted in increased public inquiry regarding historical Navy research programs, specifically those conducted under the Rainbow designation during World War II. Personnel are instructed to terminate all discussions of these programs and refer any questions to the Office of Naval Research Security Division for official response. No statements regarding Rainbow research should be made without prior approval from ONR Command. All documentation related to Rainbow programs remains classified and is not available for public review. Violations of these guidelines will be treated as unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Terminate discussions, not answer questions, not clarify misunderstandings, not provide factual corrections. Terminate." That was interesting language for a project that supposedly never existed, or had been nothing more than routine degaussing research. Henry's investigation was starting to attract attention. He noticed it gradually, the way you notice the temperature dropping degree by degree. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested surveillance. A car that seemed to be parked near his apartment more often than random chance would explain. Same make and model, different license plates, but always someone sitting in the driver's seat reading a newspaper. Phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. Not wrong numbers, not telemarketers, just silence and the faint sound of someone breathing, listening. His hotel rooms in Washington showing signs of having been searched. Nothing dramatic, nothing stolen. Just small things out of place. Clothes folded slightly differently than he'd left them. Papers in his briefcase rearranged. His notebook moved from one side of the desk to the other. Henry wasn't paranoid. He'd dealt with government surveillance before, knew what it looked like, knew how to recognize when someone was keeping tabs on your activities. But this felt more focused than his previous experiences, more interested in what he was finding and who he was talking to. He started taking precautions, made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations, safety deposit boxes, trusted friends, lawyers' offices, varied his routines, took different routes to meetings, checked for tails before conducting interviews. Then Edward Ryan called. "I found something," Ryan said. His voice was excited, breathless. "Was going through old papers from my service, stuff I hadn't looked at in decades. There's a letter from someone who was on the Eldridge. He wrote to me in '44, said he needed to tell someone what really happened. I'd forgotten about it completely, but it's here, and Henry, it confirms everything." "Can you send it to me?" Henry asked. "I'm going to make copies first, mail them to different addresses, just in case. I know it sounds paranoid, but after talking to you, after thinking about all this again, I don't want to take chances. Give me a couple of days to get everything organised and I'll call you back." Ryan never called back. 3 days later, Henry got a call from Ryan's daughter. Her father had died, heart attack in his sleep. He was 92 years old, had a history of heart disease, was on medication for high blood pressure. The doctors said it was natural causes, nothing suspicious, just an old man reaching the end of a long life. Henry felt something cold settle in his stomach. The timing, just days after Ryan had found something important, just days after he talked about making copies and sending them to safe locations. "I'm sorry for your loss," Henry said carefully. "Your father was a good man. He told me a lot about his service." "He enjoyed talking to you," Ryan's daughter said. "First time in years he'd really opened up about the war. He seemed lighter after your conversation, like he'd put down a burden he'd been carrying too long." They talked for a few more minutes. Arrangements, funeral details. Then, as they were about to hang up, Ryan's daughter mentioned something that made Henry's pulse quicken. Oh, there was something strange. 2 men came to the house the day after Dad died. Said they were from the Veterans Affairs Office, needed to collect his service records for processing. Very official, had ID badges and everything. But they didn't leave any paperwork, didn't give us any receipts, just took a box from Dad's study and left. Henry gripped the phone tighter. What did these men look like? I don't know. Average, I guess. Dark suits. I can't really remember their faces. Is that weird? I saw them, talked to them, but I couldn't describe them if you asked me. The same description Betty Kowalski had given. The same impossibility of remembering details. Men designed to be forgotten. Did they take anything else, besides the box? I'm not sure. Dad's study was kind of a mess. He'd been looking for something in there the day before he died, pulling out old folders and papers. I was going to help him clean it up after I finished work, but then She trailed off. Henry attended the funeral, paid his respects, talked to Ryan's family, didn't mention his suspicions. But after the service, when everyone else had left, he sat in his car in the cemetery parking lot and thought about the timing. Ryan finds evidence. Ryan dies 3 days later. Men in suits arrive immediately and remove his papers. A 92-year-old man with heart disease dying suddenly is unremarkable. Unless you knew what he'd been about to reveal. Unless you knew someone had a very strong interest in making sure that evidence never surfaced. Henry knew he was running out of time. The story was coming together, but it was also falling apart. Witnesses dying, documents disappearing, his own investigation increasingly compromised. He needed something definitive, something they couldn't disappear or explain away, something that would prove beyond doubt that the Philadelphia experiment had been real. He needed to find someone who'd been directly involved, someone on the inside, someone who knew exactly what had happened and could confirm the truth. That's when he found Arthur Calloway. Calloway wasn't listed on the Eldridge's crew manifest. According to Navy records, he'd served on a completely different ship, the USS El Dorado, and had been reported missing in action in 1944 during Mediterranean operations. His family had received a telegram, a flag, condolences from the Secretary of the Navy. But Henry found a discrepancy. It was small, easy to miss, the kind of thing that only emerged when you cross-referenced multiple document types. An insurance form filed by Calloway's family in 1946, trying to collect on a life insurance policy. The form listed his service history, including all ship assignments, and there, buried in the middle of the list, was a single line that didn't appear in any official Navy records. Temporary assignment USS Eldridge, special duty, October 1943. Special duty. That was Navy code for classified assignments. Operations that didn't appear on standard manifests. Henry had seen it before in other contexts. Men pulled from their regular posts for short-term assignments that needed specific expertise or security clearances. So Arthur Calloway had been assigned to the Eldridge in October 43 for special duty. And then he'd been listed as killed in action the following year. Except Arthur Calloway wasn't dead. Henry found him through a combination of bureaucratic archaeology and dumb luck. A death certificate that was filed but then withdrawn. A social security number that